Hello and welcome to Davos Direct right here on ET Now. I'm Supriya Shrinate, and thankfully what a beautiful sunny day it really has been in Davos. People say it's going to get colder at night, but what the heck, it's good to have the sun right up looking into our faces. That said, Davos really is a melting point as far as global opinion is concerned. The people who are shaping our world, the people who are making policies, all get together and put their minds on some of the most pressing issues that humanity is facing. Now, even as we wrestle with globalization and understand the impact that Industrial Revolution 4.0 is going to have, what will a digital economy mean, we can't lose sight of the fact that back home in India, the big event will be the big battle of 2019. Yes, you're right, elections that are up ahead. And which is why I caught up with RBI former Governor Raghuram Rajan and quizzed him on what he believes will be the key electoral issues, on what he believes will the Modi government be judged on, what were the big hits and the misses of Mr. Modi's tenure. Now, while he does believe GST and IBC and all those things are big hits, he also goes on to say that the elections will consider three important issues. First, it's going to be the lack of jobs. Then, where are we headed as a society? This could be the turning point for India as far as tolerance and the intolerance debate goes. And then, more importantly, institutional independence. He does believe that the RBI has been at the receiving end of this, makes a war cry for the hierarchy of the RBI governor vis-a-vis secretaries in the government of India. So this was a special conversation because I didn't just dabble in politics. We also spoke a lot about economy at large. And who better than him to ask the question on agri-relief package? Raghuram Rajan for once believes that if the relief package is coming as a substitute for what exists, it will be welcome, depending on the structure that it is. But if it is coming as an add-on, it will be difficult to wane off and will only add to long-term costs. So this was a telling conversation, a very, very pertinent conversation that we had on India's economy, the world at large, and of course, Indian politics. I did question him that if there is a coalition that comes to power later this year, and if there is a position offered to him, will he be accepting of that? Here he is, Raghuram Rajan. It's the one big global opinion that really counts as far as India and global growth and all the head and the tailwinds are concerned. Who better than Professor Raghuram Rajan, who joins us right here on ET Now. Thank you very much for being with us. The IMF has cut the global growth forecast but believes India has the potential and the growth will pick up in 2019. We have so far been a one-engine economy. Consumption has been the mainstay. Are you somebody who's going to celebrate the fact that we'll have potential to grow up, or are you a little worried that even that growth is dependent on a benign oil regime which can turn volatile anytime?
Well, there are certainly vulnerabilities. So let's start with cup half full.
Yes,
yes, it is good to see that growth continues at the 7+ pace. What is worrisome, of course, is some of the underpinnings of that growth. That, as you said, it's largely consumption, but also that it's not creating enough jobs. I mean, one can dispute the jobs figures, but the fact is there are lots of people looking for very few jobs. And so, given that, I think going forward, we have to move it towards a more job-creating economy. Otherwise, all the growth goes for nothing if it doesn't create that form of inclusion, which is good jobs.
which will mean consumption and investment will have to go hand in hand.
Absolutely. Investment has to pick up. And of course, we also have to prepare for some of the volatility that is going to occur in the world economy. Oil prices are low now. Clearly, if the world slows down, they will continue to remain low. But if there are geopolitical shocks, you could have the combination of low growth and very high oil prices. We have to buffer better. Also, there is worry about the fisc. We have a budget coming up, but we have lots of expenditure plans. And of course, as the CAG has said, the quality of our fiscal consolidation has not been great. There's a lot of off-balance sheet stuff. And so I think looking forward, it is very important we focus on macro stability, even while moving towards a more job-creating economy.
There is a broad consensus of sorts that there could be an agri-relief package in the budget this year. The finance minister has said that markets will understand that this is a rational and not a populist move. Now, to stay on the course of fiscal consolidation, that will have to be breached for a package like this. Do you believe markets will be forgiving?
Well, it depends a little on how it is structured, because in India as elsewhere, once something is given, it can't be taken back.
That's right.
So if it is structured in such a way that it substitutes for less efficient forms of giving relief to farmers, I think it could work. If on the other hand it is structured as an addition, we really have to think long term when it rolls out how much it will cost. I mean, there are so many things we've added in the last few years which are going to have long term effects. For example, health insurance. For example, the crop insurance that we're putting together. So the reality is the farm sector is not doing well. We do need to think about sensible ways of making it an engine of growth.
Will an income support or an assured sum of say 10,000 rupees per family for the land that they have be a sensible measure? I know you're absolutely against farm loan waivers, which destroy credit discipline, which have long-term impact. But do these things you believe are on your recipe list?
Let's be careful. Blanket farm loan waivers don't make sense because they go to the wrong people. There's a lot of expenditure, etc. Specific waivers in case of people who can't pay, just like you do for industrial corporations, make sense. Now, going to the issue of a universal basic income for farmers, again, to the extent it substitutes for more distortionary subsidies, it may make sense. And of course, you want to taper it off as you get to larger and larger farmers. But for that, you need to plan well. You need to identify who is eligible. And of course, there is the question of, does it go to the tenant? Does it go to the owner? What about tenant farmers? What about agricultural labor?
That's right.
Those are, now, agricultural labor, to some extent, Manrega is meant for them. But what about the tenant farmer? How do you deal with them? So these are issues that need to be thought through. And again, as I said, as a substitute, rather than adding yet another layer without trying to refigure the other layers, it makes sense.
I can't not talk about the monetary policy and without getting into the realm of what the MPC needs to do next. But do you believe the stage is set for monetary easing in India? Inflation has been well below the targeted levels of 4%. It's been below 6% for 3 years now. Growth hasn't really picked up. Do you believe there is room for monetary easing?
Well, when you say growth hasn't picked up, we started by saying that this is 7% plus and we should be celebrating. So we really have a sort of schizophrenic view here that sometimes we say growth should be much higher. On the other hand, we say, we beat our chest and say it's wonderful. The reality is that as you push growth higher, we are seeing that we're reaching the limits of our potential. And that is worrisome for inflation. I mean, headline inflation has been really low, partly because of agricultural prices. But the latest reading on core inflation suggests it's quite strong.
Yes.
Now, of course, the RBI has a mandate to focus on headline, but to some extent that was set at a time when, in fact, headline was the real problem. Now, broadly, the RBI has to look at the broader mandate of inflation. That doesn't mean changing the goalposts, but it has to worry about what core inflation means for headline down the line. And that's something that I'm sure the RBI will think about.
So you believe even though CPI may have eased, core inflation is sticky, stubborn at 5.3, 5.6% continues to be a problem. We're also talking at a time when, there are elections to be held in India. Without getting into the political realm of this, what would your assessment be of this government's performance? What would be the big hits according to you and some of the misses that you would rather have not had?
Well, I think that when you look at the government's performance, you have to look certainly at the overall growth regime. You have to look at the distribution of that growth, and this is where the worries about jobs start coming. And it is not just this government; it has been over time. In terms of having the legislative mandate, where are the positives? Where are the negatives? The positives, of course, was GST was enacted, the bankruptcy was enacted. The negatives, to some extent, is we have done little on labor flexibility, which means sort of bolstering contract labor while giving employers some flexibility. There's a win-win to be had. We haven't moved in that direction. The other big, I think, lacuna is on land acquisition. How can we speed up land acquisition using the best practices across the states? Because clearly one of the roadblocks in terms of infrastructure rollout is that. And of course, that leads to the third problem, which is our infrastructure rollout has been quite slow. And really to create jobs, especially for people leaving agriculture, infrastructure has to be central. So to some extent, I think both in terms of legislative activity in these areas, as well as improving the pace of growth, I think there's more can be done.
No, I agree with you. I mean, people who are coming out of agriculture will need jobs, and those jobs alone can be created by infrastructure, construction, and all of that. But in some sense, are you then a little concerned that if a government with this brute majority couldn't do land and labor, who could?
Well, I think
And is that going to be politically so unpalatable that we'll perhaps not see those happen?
Well, this is the difficulty of political leadership. It is how to build a consensus about these ways of reform. Many of us now have read that wonderful book about how Narasimha Rao managed those reforms from behind the scenes along with Dr. Manmohan Singh. And we need something like that somehow we need to push ahead on reforms. We need a second generation of reforms. And that needs both political will at the top as well as implementation. And I think for this, we have to move towards a more decentralized structure of government. An overly centralized structure of government may offer leadership, but may not offer the ability to implement. And one of the lacunae we've seen over the last few years is that the policy plans at the top tend to remain that. They don't get translated into implementation.
And execution and implementation is the key for a success of any reform. You've underlined some of the vulnerabilities for India and fault lines, if I may borrow your phrase, but in an election year, are elections the biggest uncertainty for the economic landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I would see elections as both, creating some degree of uncertainty about what the political establishment will be. But I would also take comfort from the previous history of Indian elections, that we've consistently brought in governments that have broadly stuck on the course of reforms. Some have moved more, some have moved less, but broadly the direction has been right. Second, I think we have to put a lot of faith in our electorate, which has sent the right message time and again. And I think in this time, this elections, as a citizen of India as opposed to an economist, I would say the three big issues on the economic front, again, at the risk of repeating, jobs. I think on the country front, I think the issue of where we go as a country, how tolerant we are of different views of minorities, I think this is an important turning point for India, and we get to choose at this point. And the third issue I would say that has been raised, and certainly is a concern, is how we protect our institutions, whether it's the Supreme Court, whether it's the Election Commission, whether it's the RBI. Those are issues that come up.
I will just talk about institutions in a bit, but markets are typically very wary of fractured mandates. They hate coalitions. Our history, though, has proven otherwise. I mean, the reform trajectory has been maintained. So two questions there. Are you somebody who varies a coalition as well? And the other question is, do you believe, irrespective of the political combination that comes to power, the trajectory on reforms is here to stay?
Well, I think there will be variation depending on the combination that comes to power. And sometimes centralized governments with one strong party tend to have more of a mandate, tend to be able to move. But we've also seen examples where they haven't moved very much. We've also seen examples of coalitions that have, in fact, moved considerably. So I would say the jury is still out. Some of our greatest reforms were under a government that basically hung on by the skin of its teeth to a majority. So I think we have to wait and see. My sense is the pressure from people now for change is increasing, and that any government will have to respond to that.
And you believe change on the three things that you spoke about: institutions, jobs, and of course the level of tolerance in the country.
Exactly.
The one point that I wanted to also speak to you about is a lot of people believe economic reforms are always difficult to sell. Is that necessarily true? Because no true reformist prime minister in India has been voted back to power. Why is that so?
Well, look, I think the real issue is that any reform tends to affect vested interests. And they coalesce very fast. And then they push against the reforms as part of a broader agenda while singling out certain downsides of those reforms. So in public opinion, it sometimes is a constant battle to defend the reforms that you're doing and explain why it's good for the broader masses. Now that's true leadership. Now it is, I think, something that we need It is something that has to be sold. I'm not a great believer in reform by stealth, though I know we have done a lot in that way. That if you have a frank conversation with the people, a lot can be sold. Now, we have to see.
So is creative incrementalism then here to stay as far as India's reform agenda is concerned? Because that perhaps is easier, politically more palatable. And also the second question is that has stigmatized capitalism, your good friend Arvind Subramanian talks about this, has that taken a toll on economic decision making in India? The perception management?
Well, historically, we have had an excessive amount of favors done for a few segments of the population. And I think, it is good for a government to be wary about that. But that said, capitalism is changing in India also. We have a lot of self-made people who have pulled themselves up not through favors but by actually producing a better product. Example, Bharat Forge, Mahindra makes good products and so on. There are lots of these big names that have done good things. So in that sense, I think it's a process by which we slowly come out. Today, if we can implement the bankruptcy code and we finally essentially reach closure on some of these, it will send a message that even the most powerful are not immune to the system and will in fact lose their firms if they mismanage them. So I think it is a process by which we steadily send the message, we want good capitalists, we're not against capitalism, we want them to create jobs, but if you want to misuse the system, there is the door for you.
Fair point indeed. And like you said, I think just again borrowing a thought from what you've espoused in public, saying debt cannot be treated as equity, and Indian promoters have done that for far too long. You started really the war against NPAs. Are you satisfied with, I'm not so sure if it's really come to its fag end, but are you satisfied with how it's progressed?
Well,
or has it been frustrating to see?
In India, you can never be satisfied with the pace of progress. You always wanted to go faster. But we have to live with what we have. And to some extent, I think it's very important to build the institutions under the bankruptcy code so that going forward, it will work really effectively. There is a backlog, of course, which has built up in the time that before it was set up. And so there will be some shortcuts initially. But going forward, we need a reliable system. We need a system which is not overwhelmed. And I hope we are in the process of creating that. And that will allow debt to actually be debt in this country.
Fair point. Few last closing questions, Dr. Rajan, and I think one of them has to be on the institutional independence that you spoke about, institutional autonomy, and any good economy has to be judged by the independence of its institutions. Some amount of tension is hardwired in the RBI government relationship, but things really went downhill. There was public name calling, there were pot shots taken at each other, and eventually an RBI governor had to resign. As somebody who headed that institution at one point in time, what was going through your mind when that was happening?
Look, the reality is, as you said, there's some constructive tension built into the relationship. And it is important for all sides to respect that constructive tension. And this means a constant process of dialogue, of backroom dialogue that takes place. Now, I think going forward, it is time that we sort of say that on occasion, this kind of dialogue can break down. And in that situation, how do we protect the relative independence of both parties? And we have to judge. Of course, the RBI works as an entity of the administration and works under the government, given the marching orders that the government has seen fit to enshrine in its mandate. But given that mandate, it should have the operational freedom to carry out that mandate. Now, earlier this was based on a kind of informal consensus. And the question we have to ask ourselves is it time to enshrine this in a much more formal consensus? Because otherwise it keeps getting eroded in one way or the other. And of course, with the wrong kinds of personalities at play, it could become problematic. We are becoming a middle-income economy. We have to ensure that our institutions are really middle-income institutions, which means we have to strengthen them where necessary.
Would you then recommend, will your policy prescription to that be a change in the RBI Act that talks about what happens during a breakdown in conversation? Because I think the one thing that a lot of people point out is, was this a mere personality clash? Because we've got a new incumbent now. It looks like the channels of communication are open. It's not as if he's written off an entire 3.6 lakh crore worth of RBI's money to the government. And still there seems to be some semblance of sanity.
Look, I wasn't in the middle of those discussions, so I don't know how much was personalities and how much was other stuff. And I do agree that we should not reform just based on specific personalities. But in a sense, the relationship between institutions should not come down to personalities. It shouldn't be up to the personalities to manage. As we become more developed, we have to manage the relationships so that it survives different personalities. And that is why I think formalizing some of the structures makes sense, so that they're not constantly eroded. For example, the position of the RBI governor, what level he or she occupies in the hierarchy, is completely left up to the spur of the moment. Right. Some secretaries pretend that they're above the RBI governor, and the hierarchy keeps getting blurred. And I think it is time that we sort of made clear what that position is and why that position exists. And similarly for the other regulators, it's not just about the RBI.
I think experts have already put out there that RBI governor in a lot of ways is at par with the finance minister, because he's doing the monetary management and the other one is doing the fiscal management. Before I let you go,
I would just say that I think it would be appropriate for the RBI governor to be below the finance minister, but typically above the bureaucracy, because it is a position that the bureaucracy attains after many years in the bureaucracy, and it is not appropriate that the RBI governor be dictated to by a secretary in the government.
Fair point indeed. Last question, and I don't want to add fuel to fire. I don't want to add to the speculation, but there are speculations that you've been approached by political parties for political manifestos and things like that. I don't want to get into the realm of this. I'd like it if you can confirm or deny. But on a larger question, if this were to be a fractured mandate in 2019, and to put things together, if you were approached, will you be open to a position back in India?
Well, first, that is a speculative question, and I don't answer them. What is true is that a bunch of economists and I have put out some ideas that up to people to take, and we've been open to talking to anybody who wants to talk to us, and we've been talking to political leaders of different kinds. In fact, here I was supposed to be on a panel with Mr. Chandrababu Naidu. Unfortunately, he could not come. But the idea is really to do what is right for India, and if we can help in any way in giving advice, I think it is very important.
It will be a sane mind that will welcome an advice, and an insane one that you have said. But thank you very much for speaking to us right here in Davos. That's Professor Raghuram Rajan in conversation with us right here at Davos at the World Economic Forum. Time for a quick breather here on Davos Direct. I come back in a conversation that I did have with KV Kamath, the present head of the BRICS Bank. I asked him questions on the controversy that plagued his former institution, the ICICI Bank, and of course, the success or the frustration that he sees when he sees the IBC in process. We also did catch up with KV Kamath, the man who once headed ICICI Bank and is, of course, the present head of India's representative at the BRICS Bank. We did ask him questions on the Indian economy, the budget, fiscal slippage and all of that. But I think the two big talking points for me from this conversation was the controversy that plagued his former institution, which is the Chanda Kochhar issue, and of course IBC, and how successful or frustrating has it been to see that bankruptcy code in process. He does assert that the IBC has for sure changed the creditor-lender, borrower relationship. People no longer take credit for granted like they once did here in India, and he says that's a very good thing. It has sent out a very strong signal. As far as the Chanda Kochhar issue is concerned, and the question largely that he was willing to answer perhaps more candidly was on the role of the board and whether there is merit in the argument that tenures of these rock star CEOs, quote unquote, should be trimmed, should be restricted. And he cited global examples and said that the world over, long tenures serve well for companies. We we should not go in that direction. But yes, boards need to be more robust, directors need to be more accountable, and which is where some amount of checks and balances can really kick in. That's KV Kamath in conversation with us right here at Davos during the World Economic Forum. All right, if you need to get a sense of the global and the Indian economy, there are few people I rely on as much as I rely on the word coming in from Mr. KV Kamath. Thank you very much for being with us right here in Davos. The global growth yesterday was revised down by the IMF. They do believe that India has the potential and growth will pick up in 2019. Are you as pessimistic about global growth and optimistic about India, or are you worried about the fact that India continues to be a one-engine economy and that engine is consumption?
The global growth indeed is under pressure. We won't go into that for a variety of reasons. And I would go with the people who are not so optimistic. I don't want to use the word pessimistic.
Right.
India clearly is on a roll. I think the equation is very simple. It's a large population which is on the move. And the base has built up quite nicely. And on that base, all you have to do is look at what is not yet done and count that and invest for that. And I think our country will grow for a very long time.
Before I go to India, sir, I have to ask you on China, and you have in some sense a global insider in China as well. People are very worried about the slowdown in China. Do you believe those fears are exaggerated? I mean, an economy with a base of $14 trillion cannot perhaps be going at 8% year on year.
Not the internal economy. I think there are enough steps which we may not be able to go through in a short interview as to what they do to keep the pump primed. And these are all, again, in the context of 1.3 billion people. As they move forward, these investments bear fruit. So they will keep that going. It's the global context which is putting pressure on China, if at all. And that is because of the global slowdown. And I think the effort within China is to see how domestic growth can make up for that. It's a very interesting balancing act. One must remember that that economy works at interest rates which are half that of India's.
That's true.
So lending rates are 7%, deposit rates are 2.5%. So the ability of the banking system to support growth is significantly more than in India. So I think all these become pluses, which keeps that country going.
Oh, absolutely. And that's an interesting perspective, and especially coming from you on China, because I think the world unduly kind of frets over the growth rates in China. But coming back to India, and I will go to basic numbers of growth and monetary easing and all of that in just a minute. But we're also talking at a time when this is an election year. We will see the big battle ahead of 2019. 5 years of this government, many reforms have been carried out. Still a lot more needs to be done. What would you assess were some of the big achievements and perhaps some of the misses?
I think the big achievements have all been articulated. To me, GST was a big achievement. I think the banker, the cleanup of the system and the legal enabling of the cleanup, because that was a challenge all these years. Putting that in place, I think, is a big plus. So the growth engines are there, and I would look at, again, 1.2, 1.3 billion people, the infrastructure needs. You pick any area, whether it is roads, whether it is water, whether it is power, whether it is homes.
True.
This is an opportunity for the next 10 years. So I wouldn't really be concerned about potential for growth in India. I think it is planning for growth and executing for growth, which should be top on the agenda.
But Mr. Kamath, even though you don't highlight the hits, so to say, but our lack of jobs and perhaps the rural stress, some of the things that you would count as pain points?
We'll have to look at where are jobs created. I think jobs are created two ways. One, the act of investment, and thereafter when the investments bear fruit.
True.
So if I'm saying that the infrastructure agenda for India is so large that should be the growth engine driver in the first place. And thereafter, when incomes rise, consumption becomes the second place. So I think we were chatting just before we started the interview whether ours is only a consumption economy. So the Indian economy, I think, is going to be led by investments and consumption. And investments, I would think there's virtual and endless opportunity on the infrastructure front. It's, I think, only constrained by our imagination. And thereafter, that will kick in the consumption cycle at a greater pace. So I'm very optimistic on India.
And that's a virtuous cycle, investments that will lead to consumption.
But virtuous cycle, you need to look at where does it stop kicking in. And again, we have China in front of us. It has not stopped kicking in even as the economy is now 9 or 10 billion, $10 trillion.
Mr. Kamath, one of the questions that I will have to ask you, because this is an election year. Markets, investors don't like uncertainty. Election is an uncertain input that comes into the economic landscape. Are you wary of what could perhaps be a fractured mandate in 2019, or do you believe the reform trajectory, irrespective of the political coalition, is here to stay?
I will not talk of politics because my current job would not
understand.
permit
Yes.
me to do
Yes.
that. Let me just put in context. I think India has grown over the last 20 years, if you see. As long as the growth momentum was there and the growth engine was pointed in the right direction, it has grown irrespective of what the political landscape is. So that's all that I would say. And I would think that successive governments, starting in the 90s, have actually laid or taken the agenda forward. So I would believe that
So what you're
India will
essentially
grow.
saying is that the reform trajectory is here to stay, irrespective of what could be the political coalition at the center.
Yeah, that's what I would think. So yes, whatever is the coalition, I think the reform agenda would proceed.
A union budget is right around the corner. Many people believe this is going to be the fine balancing act in being populist or being prudent. But if I were to tell you the landscape, and the landscape in India right now is that there is a big expectation of an agri relief package. Do you believe the markets will buy into the rationale of one, given that there is an agrarian stress and perhaps farm sector needs a helping hand?
Yeah, I'll put it this way. I think every government acts in terms of what I would call the larger public good. And I can only say that as long as any step that's taken is in the larger public good, and that always tells well on the economy. So, without first-hand having knowledge of that, I wouldn't be able to comment. But clearly, whatever is in the public good should impact well on the economy and should mean well for India.
Do you believe some amount of fiscal slippage, if it's in the larger public good, if it's a larger lifeline to a sector that needs it, is going to be acceptable?
What I have seen so far, this Indian governments are wary of any fiscal slippage. So I wouldn't take a call that there will be a fiscal slippage this time around.
That's being optimistic, and we hope the government will listen to you. But on a larger landscape, sir, you've seen the liberalized India and you've seen the conservative economy that India once was. Do you believe economic reforms in a democracy like ours are difficult to sell?
Well, as long as the fruits of growth are evenly distributed in a way that people feel it, that they have benefited from their growth, I think whatever be your government structure, I think people will welcome change.
Mr. Kamath, quickly moving on to the legislative framework for cleaning up of bad loans, and you mentioned that, and I think that's one of the big greens in this government's report card, the fact that there is an IBC in place, there's a bankruptcy code. How satisfied or how frustrated are you with the way it has gone on? It's taken too long, but many people believe we have just not resolved enough issues, only 3 or 4 big issues resolved. What would you say?
No, I think I think we need to put in context signaling that this is having. There is now a clear understanding, what I am told from the Indian end, that business is not as usual. You can no longer borrow and not pay or not afford to pay. You cannot afford not to pay. I think that is the big impact of this. As far as the process are concerned, we are a land governed by laws, and most of the things that are, in a way, getting delayed, because of due process. I think this is part of the learning curve.
You're absolutely right. It has changed the lender-buyer relationship, and Raghuram Rajan was speaking to us, and he said the one thing that it has done is it has perhaps made it very clear that debt is not equity, and many promoters in India were treating debt like that. But the larger question also is there fear that a lot of the Indian assets that end up in IBC could be gobbled up by foreign players, and many assets would go in foreign hands and not stay with India? Or is this a more schizophrenic view of how we look at the world?
I think that is a schizophrenic view. I think there will be, structures under which debt will be, in a way, reworked out, and which there may be foreign investment coming in. But I think Indian players will still have a majority of debt in their own hands. But this should not be something that we should worry about.
Are we at the tail end of the NPA cleanup?
Again, I am removed from the situation, but from all accounts that I see, we should be at the tail end of the NPA cleanup.
Just one more question on bad loans, and then I really move on to the next realm of what we want to talk about. The RBI very recently red flagged Mudra loans. There are people who red flagged MSMEs and has due diligence gone down and things like that. How do you wade through economic compulsions of doing something like this, and of course the due diligence and credit discipline that comes in?
Yeah, I can't talk of these particular loans because I honestly have not been tracking what has been happening. But I think it is RBI is within their mandate and ambit to identify where there are challenges, and it is a system which then needs to correct itself. So I'm sure this also is a learning curve, because the number of loans that would have been done under this scheme, I think, is of an order which the country has not done before. So I'm sure there are learnings there, but if there are learnings, they should be very quickly implemented.
Mr. Kamath, I think I need to ask you a little bit of an uncomfortable question there, even though you're seeing it from afar. You spoke about the RBI and how things need to be done. We did see a very public showdown of sorts. We saw an RBI governor quit, and without taking sides on this matter, as a career banker, how did you view the controversy as it played out?
The way I look at it is they're all part of a process, in the sense if somebody has laid down office, then you need to find a replacement. And all I can say is, as an external observer, there were views that there would be dire consequences. I think the system strength is shown by the fact that the system has progressed, the markets have progressed, and everything has gone, in a way that could not have been foreseen. So I think sometimes it's wrong to second guess.
Oh yes, unlike what everybody thought the markets are going to crash, none of that happened. I think we were pretty ring-fenced. But the reason, sir, I asked you that question was that many people also believe the time has perhaps come that we need to make institutional frameworks above personality clashes. And there is some amount of criticism on how an institution like RBI was perhaps dented. Would you say that? Because you've dealt with an institution like that.
I would think that RBI is.
What happens when conversation breaks down?
I admire a lot. I would think that things get settled. I never believe that things come to an impasse where things do not progress. Things get settled. Life goes on.
Fair point. Quick last questions, and this has to be on an institution that you once headed, ICICI Bank. We saw a controversy playing out there with Ms. Kochhar. From afar, did you see that controversy? And many people say, were there lack of processes and systems in place that could have seen a controversy like that break out in the first place?
And I think on that subject, sitting out here, it's very unfair for me to comment. I think let the process from within the bank articulate whatever has to be articulated. I think it's unfair for me to comment.
But is there some merit in the argument? And one has seen this happen in Axis Bank, one has seen this happen in Yes Bank, and I say, is there some merit in the argument that perhaps tenures need to be restricted? The US allows its precedent only 2 tenures because both sometimes get overtaken by powerful CEOs.
In the global context, we have seen, at least in the banking business, boards continue and the CEO continues for a very long time. I don't think there is a do or don't in this. I think the boards have to be vigilant. Governance has to be at the forefront. And the board has to course correct as it goes along. I think that's what happens everywhere. And I'm sure that's what will happen in India as this whole process of governance matures to the next level.
So you believe that robust boards should be able to take care of powerful CEOs even if they continue for many terms?
Indeed, that's the reason why you have the board in the first place. And if the boards are not going to exercise that, then I would think the boards would be derelict in their duties.
I think it's only fair that I end with asking you a question on your present duty. And IMF and World Bank are multilateral institutions, and BRICS Bank was put in place for something like this. How has the progress been, and how satisfied are you with your tenure there now? Living, have you started saying ni hao to people you meet?
Yes, I have started saying ni hao to people that I meet. The first word I learned was Lajo Jiang.
What does that mean?
Get the red chili paste. So you needed that to survive. After that, life became easy.
Yes.
I think it's now 2/3 of the way into my term.
True.
I think the bank has been set up. It is functional. It is borrowing and lending now. I think we have done almost 8 billion or a little short of 8 billion in 3 years. For the current year, we have set a very ambitious target of doubling that number.
India, are you on course?
We are on course to double that number. And India, I think we have done a little over 2.5 billion, and we aim to do 2.5 billion this year. So I think things have gone well. It's a multicultural team. It was a learning experience for me, how to work with 5 different cultures. But it's been very satisfying. And I think when I come back, probably can look back at a bank which is well set to perform in the future.
And a bank that should be our answer to the IMF and the World Banks of the world. Thank you very much, Mr. Kamath, for speaking to us. Always a pleasure. Mr. Kamath, they're in conversation with us right here at Davos at the World Economic Forum. This is a voice that matters on India's banks, Indian industry, and of course, India's economic landscape. All right, from a banker par excellence, let's turn focus to a man who's going to talk about an issue that's extremely important for India's economic landscape. And that's crude oil. Yes, I'm talking about Fatih Birol of the IEA. He was in conversation with us, and he does believe that crude oil prices are here to stay at this level, unlikely to shoot at $90 a barrel unless there is a geopolitical instability that does erupt. Of course, moving on, Fatih Birol talked about the electric vehicle drive that India is seeing, and he was very assertive when he said that the world over, the one big driver for electric vehicles has been government SOPs, has been subsidies, and without that, it will be difficult to turn India into an electric vehicle market. We in India are breathing a sigh of relief because oil prices have cooled off. But is this trend here to stay? Do you believe oil is going to be range bound? Will it continue to be sub 60?
So you are right. When the oil prices reached almost $90 last year, it was a major problem for India, but not only for India, for the global economy. True. And I said this is the prices are entering a red zone for the global economy. And many people talk with the producers to convince them to bring the prices down by releasing more oil to the markets. And my thanks to also Minister Pradhan here. Minister Pradhan, myself, many people talk with the producer, and they brought more oil to the markets. Now, when we look at this year, I see that a lot of, first of all, US oil is coming to the market. This is very good news for the consumers like India. Right. But also we are expecting how the OPEC and Russia will behave, how much oil they are going to cut from their production. But I would expect that the current price level, $60, to go once again to $90, as we have seen last year, will be very difficult if there are no major geopolitical developments.
So other than the geopolitical instability that could shoot up prices, are there any other challenges to crude oil prices? What are some of the other factors that could potentially push up oil prices?
It would have been a very strong oil demand growth, the spectacular oil demand growth, which is difficult to expect this year because global economy is slowing down, including China being one of the drivers of the global economy. And as a result of that, it will be very difficult to expect a huge oil demand growth. Therefore, I wouldn't completely exclude, of course, $90 or above, but with the current supply-demand perspective, I don't expect this will go over the roof as we have seen last year.
Dr. Birol, one of the other questions that I obviously want to ask you is that in India, we import a lot of oil from Iran. For now, we've got a buffer and, a waiver off on the sanction of the United States. But there are experts who believe that once that supply goes away, there will be perhaps suppliers, but prices for India will firm up because the Iran supply is going to go off and we get a very sweet deal from them. Is that necessarily something that you share as well?
I think we don't know. In fact, I think many people don't know how the discussions between the importers from Iran and the U.S. administration go. But currently, Iran exports about 1.3 million barrels per day of oil, almost halved compared to before sanctions. So I would expect that if the sanctions continue and tighten, this could have effect for the markets. But if you ask me whether or not this will be a huge game changer, I would be skeptical.
One of the other things that I want to specifically speak to you about, because we in India focus a lot upon this, is renewables. And world over, we are seeing that despite the subsidies that have been given, despite the SOPs that the industry has been offered, the share of renewables hasn't really gone up. I mean, they're contributing to energy requirements as much as they were doing in 1971, according to data from your own agency. Why is that so?
Now, renewables are increasing, but they are not increasing enough to make a huge change in the global energy mix. Oil, gas, coal still constitute more than 80% of the global energy today. In India, I see that, for example, solar is becoming cheaper and cheaper, but we use solar only part of the electricity generation. Energy is used everywhere. The transportation, industry, households, renewables is only, or mainly I should say, for the electricity generation. So to think that with the renewables we can fix all the problems is extremely optimistic. But renewables will be a part of the solution. But in India, for example, transportation sector is very important. Right. I would very much urge India to make more use of railways, for example. In fact, at the end of this month, 30th of January, I am coming to New Delhi to release a major intention report with Minister Piyush Goyal on the railways, how important railways are and how much it can help India and the others to save oil and to save energy.
You know, speaking about India and the electric vehicle drive that we want to have, and you know, there are these robust claims that are being made that we could turn completely electric vehicle by 2030. Do you believe it's important to have realistic assessments, realistic targets and achieve them? Because, you know, an entire market turning electric vehicle by 2030 perhaps is inconceivable, is it not?
I think electric vehicles are growing across the world. We have, as of today, when we speak, there are 5 million electric cars across the world.
But do we have the required ecosystem in India?
But 5 million in the world. But if you ask the other cars, the traditional cars, they are 1 billion. 1 billion versus yeah. So electric vehicles will grow. But if you ask me if 2030 all the cars will be electric in the world, I would say I would be very, very skeptical to believe so.
But do you believe for electric vehicles to be a success in India, it needs the subsidies that the government has to offer? Will industry has to be incentivized to move in the direction, fiscal SOPs perhaps?
It is everywhere in the world. There is a subsidy for electric cars. You can take Norway, you can take France, you can take wherever you want. On average, an electric car in the world enjoys $6,000 subsidy. So whether or not the Indian government is ready to give this subsidy for thousands and millions of people is a question that they have to think carefully.
That's it then. It's a wrap here on this edition of Davos Direct. We'll continue to get you more conversations, perspective and opinion from people who are really shaping the world that we live in. Thank you very much for being with us.